written in the same reconstructed narrative style inspired by the types of civil disputes commonly featured on the series rather than a verified transcript. Begins with a lawsuit between the owner of a small landscaping company and a homeowner over an extensive backyard renovation project that allegedly ended with unpaid invoices, damaged irrigation systems, and disagreements about the quality of completed work. The plaintiff, who has operated his landscaping business for nearly 15 years, explains that the defendant hired his company to redesign an aging backyard that included replacing the lawn, installing decorative stone walkways, planting mature trees and shrubs, constructing raised flower beds, and installing a new automatic irrigation system. According to the plaintiff, the parties met several times to discuss design ideas before signing a detailed written contract with a projected completion date of 8 weeks. The plaintiff testifies that construction began on schedule. Existing vegetation was removed, grading work was completed, underground irrigation lines were installed, and shipments of decorative stone and mature plants arrived without delay. During the first month, the defendant regularly complimented the progress and even recommended the company to several neighbors. However, as the project neared completion, disagreements developed over the final appearance of the landscape. The defendant claimed that several trees had been planted in the wrong locations, portions of the walkway were uneven, and sections of the new lawn began turning brown only weeks after installation. Because of those concerns, the defendant refused to make the final payment required under the contract. According to the plaintiff, he repeatedly offered to return and address any legitimate concerns. He claims his crew adjusted portions of the stone walkway, replaced several damaged shrubs at no additional charge, and inspected the irrigation system after the defendant complained that parts of the lawn were not receiving sufficient water. During the inspection, the plaintiff allegedly discovered that several underground sprinkler heads had been broken by another contractor installing outdoor lighting after the landscaping work had already been completed. He argues that any irrigation problems resulted from those later modifications rather than defects in his own installation. The plaintiff now seeks payment of the remaining contract balance together with additional labor costs incurred during multiple return visits. The defendant disputes many of those claims. She explains that while the early stages of construction appeared satisfactory, the finished project differed significantly from the design plans she had approved. According to her testimony, 2 ornamental maple trees blocked views from the patio. The decorative stone edging did not follow the agreed layout, and large areas of sod died despite her following the watering instructions provided by the plaintiff. She also argues that the plaintiff repeatedly postponed warranty service appointments, forcing her to hire another landscaping company to diagnose the irrigation problems. Judge Judy immediately requests the written landscaping contract together with the approved design drawings. The plaintiff produces a detailed agreement outlining plant selections, construction specifications, payment milestones, and a 1-year workmanship warranty. Judge Judy reviews the documents carefully before asking whether any changes to the design were approved during construction. The plaintiff produces several text messages in which the defendant requested minor adjustments to the placement of flower beds but acknowledges that the tree locations were modified based on recommendations from his crew without obtaining written approval. The defendant introduces photographs taken shortly after completion of the project. The images show patches of dead grass, uneven joints between several sections of decorative stone, and standing water near one corner of the patio after rainfall. Judge Judy studies the photographs and asks whether those conditions were documented before the plaintiff's final visit. The defendant confirms they were. Attention then shifts toward the irrigation system. The plaintiff calls his irrigation technician as a witness. According to his testimony, several sprinkler heads had been cracked by excavation work performed after the landscaping project was completed. He explains that such damage would reduce water pressure and prevent sections of the lawn from receiving adequate irrigation. Judge Judy asks whether the broken components were consistent with accidental impact from later construction equipment. The technician replies that they were. The defendant responds by calling the owner of the outdoor lighting company. He testifies that his crew installed low-voltage wiring several weeks after the landscaping project, but insists they carefully located underground utilities before digging. However, he acknowledges that one sprinkler head may have been accidentally damaged during installation and replaced immediately afterward. Judge Judy notes that this testimony supports at least part of the plaintiff's explanation regarding irrigation problems. Discussion then turns toward the placement of the ornamental trees. The plaintiff argues that relocating the trees slightly improved long-term growth and visual balance within the landscape. Judge Judy responds that aesthetic improvements should never be made without first obtaining the customer's approval when specific design plans have already been agreed upon. An independent landscape architect appears as an expert witness. After reviewing the completed project, he concludes that the overall workmanship is generally professional. The walkways are structurally sound, drainage appears adequate after minor adjustments, and the majority of the plantings are healthy. However, he agrees that the ornamental trees differ from the approved design, and that portions of the stone edging require modest correction to achieve consistent appearance. The plaintiff becomes frustrated, arguing that the defendant enjoyed the new landscape for months before refusing to make final payment. The defendant responds that she withheld payment only after repeated requests for corrections went unresolved. Judge Judy reminds both parties that construction disputes often escalate because communication deteriorates after projects near completion. Closing arguments summarize the disagreement. The plaintiff argues that he substantially completed the contract and should receive the remaining payment because most alleged defects either resulted from later contractors or have already been corrected. The defendant maintains that she should not pay in full for a landscape that failed to match the approved design and required additional work by others. Judge Judy carefully reviews the contract, design plans, photographs, text messages, expert testimony, invoices, and payment records before announcing her decision. She concludes that the plaintiff substantially performed the landscaping contract and that much of the lawn damage resulted from irrigation components, later damaged during unrelated construction. However, she also finds that the plaintiff improperly relocated the ornamental trees without obtaining customer approval and failed to complete several cosmetic corrections before demanding final payment. Judge Judy orders the defendant to pay most of the remaining contract balance, but reduces the amount to reflect the reasonable cost of relocating the trees and correcting the decorative stone edging. She declines to award the plaintiff additional labor charges for return visits because those visits largely involved warranty obligations already included under the original agreement. Before dismissing the parties, Judge Judy offers practical advice to contractors and homeowners alike. Landscape projects should be documented with detailed plans, and any significant design changes should receive written approval before implementation. Homeowners should promptly report concerns and provide contractors with a reasonable opportunity to make corrections before hiring others to complete the work. The litigants leave the courtroom with mixed results. The landscaping company recovers most of the money it earned while accepting responsibility for unauthorized design changes, and the homeowner receives compensation for the corrections necessary to bring the project into compliance with the original plans. Judge Judy concludes the case with another familiar lesson. Good craftsmanship creates beautiful landscapes, but clear communication is what keeps business relationships from withering. Continues with a second case involving a dispute between a professional wedding photographer and a newly married couple over unpaid service fees, delivery of digital photographs, and allegations that important moments from the wedding ceremony were either missed or photographed poorly. The plaintiff, a photographer with more than a decade of experience specializing in weddings and family events, explains that the defendants hired her approximately 9 months before their wedding after viewing her portfolio and meeting for several planning consultations. According to her testimony, the parties signed a written agreement covering full-day photography, an engagement photo session, digital editing of all usable images, an online gallery, and a professionally designed wedding album. The total contract price required an initial deposit followed by a final payment due 1 week before the ceremony. The plaintiff states that the defendants paid the deposit on time but repeatedly delayed the remaining balance, hoping to preserve the business relationship. She agreed to photograph the wedding after receiving assurances that payment would be made immediately afterward. On the wedding day she arrived early, photographed preparations at both the bride's and groom's locations, covered the ceremony, family portraits, reception events, speeches, cake cutting, and the couple's first dance. According to her testimony, she worked for nearly 12 consecutive hours, later spending several weeks editing more than 2,000 photographs before delivering a private online gallery containing hundreds of professionally processed images. Despite repeated invoices, the remaining balance was never paid. She now seeks the unpaid contract amount together with reimbursement for album production costs already incurred. The defendants dispute the plaintiff's version of events. They acknowledge that payment remains outstanding but argue that the photography failed to meet the quality promised during the consultation process. According to the bride, several important family members appeared in very few photographs. The groom's grandparents were never photographed together with the couple, and portions of the outdoor portrait session appeared poorly exposed because of bright afternoon sunlight. The groom also claims that photographs of the exchange of wedding rings were partially obstructed by guests standing in the aisle. Because these moments could never be recreated, the defendants believe they should not be required to pay the full contract price. Judge Judy immediately requests the written photography agreement together with the wedding timeline prepared before the event. The plaintiff provides the contract, which specifies coverage hours, editing obligations, payment deadlines, and a clause explaining that no photographer can guarantee every requested image when circumstances beyond reasonable control interfere. Judge Judy reviews the documents carefully before asking whether the defendants ever created a written list of must-have family photographs. The plaintiff produces a planning questionnaire completed by the bride several weeks before the wedding. Attention then shifts toward the missing family portraits. The bride explains that the groom's grandparents left the reception early because one of them became ill, preventing additional photographs later in the evening. The plaintiff responds that she repeatedly announced family portrait sessions immediately after the ceremony, but several relatives, including the grandparents, were unavailable at that time. Judge Judy asks whether anyone informed the photographer that those relatives would leave early. Both defendants admit no one specifically mentioned it. The plaintiff introduces the complete digital gallery together with timestamps showing the sequence of photographs captured throughout the day. Judge Judy reviews selected images and notes that the ceremony, reception, decorations, and many family members appear extensively documented. She asks the plaintiff why no unobstructed ring exchange photograph exists. The plaintiff explains that several guests unexpectedly stepped into the aisle with cell phones despite repeated requests by the officiant to remain seated. She also presents wide-angle photographs showing those guests partially blocking her line of sight. An experienced wedding planner appears as an expert witness. According to her testimony, photographers routinely encounter unpredictable obstacles during live ceremonies, particularly when guests ignore instructions regarding photography. She explains that experienced professionals generally adapt as effectively as possible, but cannot physically move through guests during critical moments without disrupting the ceremony itself. The defendants also complain about the outdoor portraits, arguing that harsh sunlight produced shadows across several images. The plaintiff responds by presenting additional edited versions demonstrating that exposure had been corrected during post-production. Judge Judy compares both versions and remarks that while some lighting conditions appear challenging, the overall quality remains professional. Discussion broadens into the unpredictable nature of live event photography. Judge Judy explains that unlike studio photography, weddings occur in constantly changing environments involving weather, lighting, guest behavior, and strict scheduling. Perfection cannot reasonably be guaranteed, but photographers remain responsible for exercising professional judgment and reasonable diligence. The plaintiff testifies that despite the payment dispute, she nevertheless completed editing, maintained secure backups of every photograph, and delayed printing the wedding album only because the contract required final payment before production. She expresses disappointment that months of work remain uncompensated despite delivering hundreds of professionally edited images. The defendants acknowledge receiving and downloading the digital gallery. They admit sharing many of the photographs with family and posting numerous images on social media, but maintain that the missing moments significantly reduced the overall value of the service. Closing arguments summarize the disagreement. The plaintiff argues that she fulfilled every major contractual obligation and cannot be blamed for circumstances beyond her control during a live wedding. The defendants insist that once-in-a-lifetime events demand exceptional performance and that important omissions justify reducing the final payment. Judge Judy carefully reviews the written agreement, planning documents, photographs, timestamps, witness testimony, invoices, and correspondence before delivering her decision. She concludes that the plaintiff substantially performed the contract and provided professional quality photography under challenging conditions. The evidence demonstrates that many of the alleged missing photographs resulted from guest behavior and scheduling issues rather than negligence by the photographer. Furthermore, the defendants continued using the delivered images extensively while refusing to complete payment. Judge Judy orders the defendants to pay nearly the entire remaining contract balance together with the documented cost of the custom wedding album, already prepared for production. However, she reduces the award slightly to account for several minor editing delays that exceeded the timeline promised in the original agreement. Before dismissing the parties, Judge Judy offers practical advice to photographers and clients alike. Wedding photographers should insist upon detailed family shot lists, designate helpers to gather relatives before portraits, and clearly explain the limitations imposed by live events. Couples, meanwhile, should recognize that no photographer can recreate moments interrupted by circumstances outside anyone's control. The litigants leave the courtroom with a clearer understanding of their responsibilities. The photographer receives compensation for months of creative work, while the newlyweds are reminded that memories captured imperfectly are still valuable when preserved with professionalism and care. Judge Judy concludes the case with another practical observation. The best wedding photographs depend not only on the person holding the camera, but also on the cooperation of everyone standing in front of it.